"I don't need money, just a hug," the girl said to the millionaire. He approached her and broke down into crying. Rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows of the cafe where they stood, as if the sky itself was trying to soften the moment. She looked impossibly small in her patched coat, hair clinging damply to her temples. He had expected her to stretch out her hand for a few bills or mumble something about spare change. That was how it always went. But instead, she had looked up with those wide, solemn eyes and asked for something that no wealth in the world could purchase. A hug. And in that instant, something fractured inside him. The walls he had so meticulously built with contracts, investments, and lavish acquisitions crumbled under the simplest of human requests. His shoulders heaved as he drew closer, feeling the chasm of his own emptiness swallowing him whole. He pressed his trembling arms around her delicate frame, clutching her as though she were the last true thing left in a world he no longer recognized. She didn't flinch or hesitate. Her tiny arms slid around his waist, and she simply held on. He could smell rainwater in her hair, the faint trace of lavender soap. And in that quiet embrace, memories returned like ghosts he had tried to bury, long-forgotten afternoons in a modest kitchen with his mother humming softly, the warmth of his father's hand on his shoulder, the honest laughter of simpler days before ambition devoured him. They stood like that for what felt like hours. Around them, people whispered, some shaking their heads in confusion, others averting their eyes as though witnessing something too raw to be polite. But neither of them cared. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were red-rimmed and glistening. He searched her face for some sign of ulterior motive, some confirmation that he was being manipulated as he'd been so many times before. But there was only sincerity in her expression, a quiet kindness that disarmed every defense he still clung to. Why would you ask me for that?" he rasped, voice hoarse from emotion he didn't even know he still possessed. "Because," she said simply, "you looked lonelier than I feel." A single tear escaped down his cheek. Her words felt like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. In that instant, the mansion he'd just left behind, its marble floors and endless rooms, seemed emptier than this rain-slicked sidewalk. He realized he had spent decades mistaking luxury for love, mistaking status for connection. Yet here was a child with nothing to offer but compassion, and somehow she had given him more than anyone else ever had. "Where are your parents?" he managed, clearing his throat as he glanced around for any sign that she might belong to someone nearby. She looked down, twisting her small fingers together. "I don't have any. At least not anymore." The rain quickened, drumming on the awning above them. A hollow ache bloomed in his chest. For a moment, he thought of all the charities he'd donated to, anonymous gestures that required no real sacrifice, no real vulnerability. He had always comforted himself with the notion that he was doing enough, that he was a good man because he could write a check and forget the rest. But now he saw what he had been running from. He saw the cost of a life measured in transactions instead of tenderness. "What's your name?" he asked, voice trembling. "Lila," she said. Her eyes were dark, clear pools that reflected his own grief back at him. He nodded slowly. "Lila, I don't know how to thank you." She tilted her head as though puzzled by the idea that something as simple as a hug required gratitude. "You don't have to," she replied. "Sometimes people just need to be held." A gust of wind sent a shiver through her, and he realized how thin her coat was. He took off his own tailored overcoat, ridiculously expensive, he thought with sudden embarrassment, and draped it gently over her shoulders. "It's warm," she murmured, hugging it to herself. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "It suits you more than it ever suited me." Lila smiled, a small, luminous smile that seemed to lift the gloom around them. "You should smile more," she told him softly. "You look less sad when you do." He tried, but it came out a broken, uncertain curve of the lips. Still, she nodded as though it was perfect. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined by the numbers in his accounts or the properties he owned. He felt human, and terrifyingly, beautifully incomplete. She took his hand, small fingers curling trustingly around his. It was such a simple gesture that it nearly undid him again. All the money he had earned, all the accolades he'd collected, none of it had brought him the peace he felt in that moment, standing beside this little girl who asked for nothing but a touch of humanity. He felt the heat of her tiny hand seep into his chilled skin as though she were quietly mending something broken inside him. A taxi pulled up to the curb, splashing water across the cracked pavement. For a moment, he thought about offering to take her somewhere, anywhere she wanted, but part of him was afraid she would vanish if he let go, like a dream dissolving at dawn. "Do you have someplace to stay tonight?" he asked, voice unsteady as he watched her study the passing headlights. Lila looked up with that same frank gaze, and it struck him again how unafraid she seemed, as if she had already learned the world could be both cruel and unexpectedly kind. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here. They have blankets if you get there early." He felt an ache so fierce it almost made him stagger. He had dined in restaurants where a single meal cost more than this child had probably seen in a year. He had invested in companies whose profits dwarfed the operating budgets of all the shelters in the city. Yet he had never paused to imagine what it meant to be small and alone, measuring safety by whether you were early enough to claim a blanket. "Would you let me walk you there?" he asked carefully, afraid she might say no. Her eyes softened. "If you want to." He nodded and felt her fingers squeeze his hand. They began walking through the wet streets together. Shop signs flickered in the rain, and cars hissed past. But for once he wasn't thinking about meetings or mergers or the next acquisition waiting on his desk. He was thinking only of her, the fragile weight of her trust, and how astonishing it was that she had given it to him so freely. She hummed a little tune under her breath as they went. It was thin and sweet, and he recognized it distantly. A lullaby his mother had once sung when he was too small to understand the words. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over him. He couldn't recall the last time he'd felt so vividly awake, so raw and alive. When he opened them again, Lila was studying his face as though trying to read his thoughts. "You look like someone who misses home," she said quietly that he swallowed hard. "I suppose I do. Maybe you should go back," she suggested in her small, practical voice. He shook his head. "I don't think I know where it is anymore." She didn't argue. She just nodded solemnly, as if she understood that sometimes people lose things they can't name. For the rest of the walk, they said very little. But the silence was not empty. It was full of the strange, unspoken recognition that neither of them was quite as alone as they had been an hour before. When they reached the shelter, he stared at the cracked stone steps and the peeling sign. It looked nothing like the world he came from, but in some way it seemed more honest, more real. "Is this where you stay every night?" he asked. "Most nights," she said. She didn't sound ashamed or afraid, just matter of fact. He felt a tide of helplessness rising in him. He could buy the building outright, refurbish every wall, hire staff to care for every child inside. And yet he sensed that wasn't what she needed from him. Not right now. Before she climbed the steps, she turned to face him. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks, and rain glittered on her eyelashes. "Thank you for walking with me," she said softly. "No," he whispered, voice unsteady. "Thank you, Lila. You've given me more than you'll ever know." She tilted her head. It was just a hug. But it wasn't. They both knew it. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, the same one he gave to executives and dignitaries, and pressed it into her hand. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, please call this number." Lila studied it with a faint, curious frown, as though the embossed letters meant little to her. Then she looked up and smiled, the smallest, sweetest smile he had ever seen. "Okay," she said, though he suspected she never would. Still, it felt important that he try. She turned and climbed the steps, her small figure disappearing into the dim interior. He stood there for a long time, rain soaking through his hair, until he realized that he was clutching his own arms to his chest, as though trying to hold on to the feeling she'd left him with. When he finally turned to walk away, the city seemed different, less like a machine grinding endlessly toward profit, more like a place where moments of grace still survived. He thought of Lila's words, "You look lonelier than I feel," and felt the truth of them like a wound. He didn't go back to his penthouse that night. Instead, he walked aimlessly through the neon-lit avenues, remembering how her tiny hands had felt in his and how her hug had cracked something open inside him. He passed other doorways where people huddled against the rain, their eyes wary or hopeless, and for the first time he stopped to look at them, really look. At one corner, a young woman sat beneath an awning, rocking a baby to sleep. She glanced up with tired eyes as he approached, and he realized he had nothing to offer her that could compare to what Lila had offered him. But he crouched beside her anyway, speaking gently, as though he might finally begin to understand what it meant to be present without conditions. That he crouched there for a long moment, the rain easing into a light mist as if the storm itself had grown weary. The young woman glanced at him again, cautious at first, but something in his expression must have softened her guard. Her baby stirred, letting out a tiny whimper that barely rose above the hum of the city. He watched the child's fragile fist grasp the air, and something shifted within him again. A deeper awakening, quiet but powerful. "Do you need anything?" he asked gently, his voice nearly drowned by the hiss of passing tires and the distant clatter of a subway train. The woman hesitated. Her eyes flicked over his watch, his polished shoes, the fine cut of the shirt now soaked and clinging to his skin. She probably assumed he was another man playing savior for a moment, ready to toss money at a problem and vanish before the thank you could be uttered. "I've got milk," she said quietly, "but we haven't eaten since yesterday." He nodded slowly, without pity, without patronizing sympathy. "Would you let me buy you both a meal?" Still guarded, she nodded. "If it's close by." "There's a place," he said, scanning the street until he found it, a small 24-hour diner tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a graffiti-covered laundromat. "It's warm, and they serve real food. Nothing fancy." She stood carefully, cradling the baby against her chest. He watched how gently she moved, the fierce love in every small gesture. As they crossed the street together, he offered no umbrella, no small talk. Only silence and presence, the kind he'd just learned had more value than diamonds. Inside the diner, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow across vinyl booths and time-worn menus. A waitress with a tired smile nodded at them. He let the woman choose a seat near the window while he ordered hot soup, bread, eggs, and warm milk. The baby had fallen back asleep, tiny chest rising and falling with the peace of oblivion. The mother's hands were trembling as she accepted the bowl of soup, not from hunger alone, but from something deeper, perhaps disbelief, or perhaps exhaustion from holding herself together too long. He watched her for a while before asking her name. "Sandra," she replied between careful spoonfuls. "And your baby?" "Amira." "Beautiful names." She nodded, eyes fixed on her food. "Thank you for this." He shook his head. "No need. I should have seen people long before tonight." Something flickered across her face, confusion, maybe curiosity. But she didn't ask what he meant. And he was grateful. He wouldn't have known how to explain it anyway. This strange unraveling of a man who had once defined himself by boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, now finding more meaning in a single cup of soup shared under humming lights. As Sandra ate, he found himself watching the door, half expecting Lila to walk back in. It was absurd, he knew. But something about her presence had embedded itself in his thoughts like a melody he couldn't forget. He wondered where she was sleeping in that building. If someone had offered her another blanket. If she had eaten. He looked down at the table, then back up at Sandra. "What would help you most right now? Not just tonight, but really help." She blinked at him, caught off guard by the sincerity of the question. "A place where I'm not afraid to sleep," she said after a long pause. "A job that doesn't make me choose between food and being there for her." She glanced down at Amira. "I don't want much. Just a start. A real one." He reached into his wallet, not for cash, but for another card. This one had a different number, one that rang directly to his assistant. He scribbled something on the back. "Call this tomorrow," he said, sliding it across the table. "Her name is Elise. Tell her I sent you. She'll arrange housing, childcare, whatever you need. And if you're willing to work, I have places that could use someone with your courage." Her hands hovered above the card like it was a delicate treasure. "Why are you doing this?" He paused. The answer was simple and complicated all at once. "Because a little girl reminded me tonight that being rich doesn't mean anything if you've forgotten how to be human." For the first time, Sandra smiled, not a guarded, polite smile, but a genuine, unfiltered one that reached her tired eyes. "Then I hope more people remember like you did." He leaned back, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in his chest. Redemption, maybe. Or just the beginning of it. They finished their meal in silence. When Sandra stood to leave, he didn't follow. He knew she needed to walk her own steps from here. But she turned back at the door, mouthed a quiet thank you, and disappeared into the soft gray of the early morning light. He remained there, alone in the booth, the empty soup bowls cooling in front of him, the baby's faint sighs still echoing in his ears. He realized something else. Then, that money had always been his language of comfort. He had never truly understood how to give without controlling, how to help without ego. Until now. Until Lila. He paid the bill and stepped outside. The city was waking up slowly, its heartbeat steady and dull. Yet everything around him looked different, as if a veil had been lifted. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel wealthy. He felt responsible. And somehow, lighter than he had in decades. As he walked past the shelter again, He found himself pausing at the same steps where Lila had turned back hours ago. A security light buzzed above the door, and behind it, a shadow moved, small, quick, and unmistakably familiar. He stood frozen at the base of the shelter steps, heart hammering like he'd stumbled into the final page of a book he didn't know he was writing. The small figure at the door paused, as if sensing his presence. When she turned, the dim light caught her face, those same wide, unflinching eyes, the soft curve of a smile that carried something ancient and knowing. Lila. She didn't look surprised to see him. It was as though she had expected it all along, as if the invisible thread that bound their two souls had simply pulled them back together. She descended the steps quietly, the oversized coat still draped around her shoulders like a royal mantle. It looked even more out of place on her now, in the daylight, but she wore it like it meant something. Like it wasn't just fabric, it was a promise, a memory, a moment she'd given him that had changed everything. "You came back," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the sounds of the waking street. "I had to," he said, swallowing a sudden rush of emotion. "I couldn't leave it there." "Leave what?" "The lesson," he murmured, his voice cracking. "The one you taught me." She tilted her head. "About hugs." He let out a soft, broken laugh. "About life." She smiled again, this time with the confidence of someone far older than her years. "People forget. It's okay. The world moves fast, and kindness gets small. But when you remember, it matters." He knelt to her level, gently reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her damp forehead. "I remembered because of you, Lila. You reminded me that all the things I've built don't mean a thing if I don't know how to be real, if I don't know how to feel." She looked at him for a long moment, then wrapped her arms around his neck once more, no longer asking, no longer waiting for permission. And again, he let himself melt into that pure, unfiltered connection. There were no cameras, no boardrooms, no headlines. Just the simple act of two human hearts recognizing each other in the wild chaos of the world. When they pulled apart, he took a deep breath and reached into his jacket pocket. Not for money, not for a business card, but for something far more personal. A small silver locket. "I used to carry this when I was young," he said, placing it in her hands. "Inside is a photo of my mother. She was the last person to truly see me until you came along. I want you to have it, not because it's expensive, but because it's real. And real things should be with real people." Lila opened the locket carefully, eyes scanning the faded photograph. She smiled. "She looks kind." "She was," he whispered. "Just like you." She held it to her chest like it was a treasure and looked up at him with a seriousness that pierced right through him. "So what are you going to do now?" He straightened slowly, staring down the street where morning light spilled over cracked sidewalks and forgotten corners. Everything differently. In the weeks that followed, the man known in financial circles as a stone-hearted tycoon began showing up in places no one expected. Shelters, soup kitchens, schools. He didn't come with press releases or cameras. He came with sleeves rolled up and ears open. He sat with people. He listened to their stories. He funded programs, yes, but more importantly, he rebuilt his soul piece by piece through the people he had once passed without a glance. His companies changed, too. Corporations known for cold ambition began to implement empathy-driven leadership. He established a foundation in Lila's name, one focused not on handouts but on human dignity. Not charity, but transformation. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story is what happened 1 year later. It was a crisp autumn morning when a modest community center opened its doors in the heart of the city. A place for children without homes, for mothers looking for fresh starts, for lonely souls in need of a hand to hold. The walls were painted in warm colors, laughter echoed through the halls, and on the front gate hung a small brass plaque that simply read, "Because one hug changed everything." And at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, surrounded by volunteers and city officials, he stood quietly beside a young girl in a patchwork dress and a locket around her neck. She didn't need a microphone to command the crowd's attention. She simply stepped forward, raised her eyes to the people, and said, "Sometimes the smallest things can wake up the biggest hearts." The applause that followed wasn't for wealth or prestige. It was for the miracle of remembering, for the reminder that no one is too rich to be broken, and no one is too poor to offer healing. And as he watched her speak, tears shimmering once again in his eyes, he realized something astonishing. She hadn't saved him with a hug. She'd saved him by seeing him, through the armor, beyond the fortune, into the hollow spaces even he had forgotten were there. And in that silent understanding, As her hand reached for his once more, he knew with absolute certainty. He would never forget again.